A couple of our previous speakers have mentioned some of what I'll talk about, and Alex did a great job of saving me time talking about why this is so difficult. Where we are today is what I will spend most of my time talking about, what some of the solutions are for these difficult problems, and then a little bit about what's left to do after. And we're very practical, so I'll give you lots of links and resources that you can use today. So many people have not heard of Benetech, my organization, but many others have heard of Bookshare. We are those same people. Bookshare is a library of ebooks that are accessible, available around the world. We have users in 60 countries with, in the US, 340,000 titles, in France about 200,000 titles, 360,000 members, and as of earlier this year, 7 million ebooks have been downloaded in accessible formats. But I'm not going to talk about that today, so forget that. I'm going to talk about another initiative that we work on that is really about the future. And Bookshare has lots of future, but really I'm interested in this discussion to talk about how born digital materials, things that are really produced in EPUB 3 from the beginning, produced to be made on some sort of electronic device and used on some sort of electronic device, how anything born digital can be born accessible. You can imagine some of our Bookshare team got a little nervous a few years ago when I started talking about this because they said, really? But what about Bookshare? There's a lot of connection, and for some time to come, until all materials really are available and born accessible, there's a lot of work for libraries around the world to do, and I should not forget to say that through Bookshare, we are also a partner with AVH in France. So lots of room to grow, but we think the time is here. There's a great opportunity with these digital production chains to actually allow, as George has spoken about, all of these things to actually start to be accessible from the beginning and have one version that goes out that can be used by everyone. Now, Alex did a great job, as I said, of talking about the fact that there are special challenges with anything science, technology, engineering, and maths, which STEM is a typical abbreviation for that. They're very complicated. There are complicated diagrams, complicated notation, etc. So we've also been running a center for 5 years called the Diagram Center, and this is all about digital image and graphic resources for accessible materials. Now, when we think about images and graphics, we're including math in that because of the fact that it's mostly presented as images today, which I'll talk about further. The whole goal is to make it faster, easier, and cheaper to really do the hard things Alex just spoke about. And part of what we do is provide standards and guidelines and work with George Kirscher and the DAISY Consortium extensively, as well as the W3C and other standards bodies around the world and publishing groups to say this stuff really can be born accessible. We also are interested to make sure that materials that are old-fashioned, that have been born inaccessible, that there are some tools for educators, for global libraries and others to create some accessibility within them. So we look at both, but I want to talk today about the born accessible side. So the areas that I want to cover are image descriptions, tactile graphics, 3D objects, accessible math, sonification, and interactives and widgets. Now I'm going to save demonstrations of these for the demo session that comes next, and I'm going to save the really deep dive into things like math and chemistry for the next 2 speakers. So I get to just give you the overview, I guess, right now. So for image description, under Diagram, we developed a tool called Poet. And Poet has now developed into 2 tools. One that I'll demo demonstrate later, is actually to create image descriptions. So you can take a book, see all the images, and actually go type in a description of those images. The other thing we found is that more and more publishers and professional content creators wanted to answer one question. How do I do it? Show me how I do it and what it means to create an image description, or what are the different ways to make images accessible. So we've also developed a part of Poet that is a training tool that literally walks someone through the steps of making different sorts of scientific images accessible. And in the demo, I'll show you that you can pick what kind of image it is, and it literally gives you tips and templates. Now, I was speaking with someone last night. It's actually harder to do things like art. Because if you look at a painting, it's very subjective. Whereas if you're looking at a biology diagram of a heart and lungs, there are some important things to convey about that. And usually the book gives you some clues about what that should be. So it's important that this training module is available today, free, online, open. And I will give you links as well at the end. So that's a lot about how you describe images. And the first thing that we discussed in our first diagram meeting was that even if you use some other thing like a tactile graphic, you still really do need a description. You need a way that somebody understands what that tactile is meant to tell them. So we started with description because it's core to everything. Now, however, sometimes a description really isn't enough on its own. So tactile graphics have been around for some time, but there are some great advances with technology that really allow tactile graphics to come alive and have different formats. They are often needed for charts, for diagrams and schematics and maps. They really help give you a spatial understanding, and across those topics where those things come up, across STEM and across geography. These are quite useful tools. So one of the other things we've produced in Diagram that's available to everyone is called the Accessible Image Sample Book. So when content producers came and said, show us examples. Okay, you've given us rules, you've given us guidelines. We've developed something called the Top Tips for Accessible EPUB 3 that George informs me we're very close at having a new version out. I think it's in my team reviewing it. This is in conjunction with IDPF, the International Digital Publishing Forum, to say, what are these tips to help people know what to do? But then they said, I also want examples. And so we've created the Accessible Image Sample Book to show examples of, I think, pretty much every kind of way to make an image or graphic accessible. These are usable examples. You can see the actual code so that somebody who's producing materials can put it into action. We've had a number of training webinars and such on this that are available through the Diagram Center website, which is diagramcenter.org, spelled in the American way with an ER in center, not RE, sorry. Those have been widely attended by universities who are doing work on materials, certainly by publishers, by educational software makers as well. Now, the sample book has things in it like something around this heart and lung diagram. You can describe it, quite useful. But you also might want to have a two-dimensional tactile version. This shows a picture of the same pages from a book with a tactile of the diagram and Braille for the text around it and giving you a description. So quite useful to feel the outlines of these items. Now, another type of way to show an image is through 3D printing. As George mentioned, this is something we're very active, and we have a 3D printing activity going on next week with a lot of museums, libraries, educators, and accessibility people, because something like a carbon atom on the screen, I'm holding up a 3D printed version of this carbon atom. the file that you would see looks like this. This is actually a 3D design of this carbon atom, and this is available for free. You can get this design, and if you have a 3D printer, you can print it off. We think that 3D printing is coming. It's used in the mainstream, so it's getting cheaper, it's getting faster. You can do it in colors, you can do it in metal, but it's still not really there for everyone to use. We see a lot of schools in the United States have these printers, but they still have lots of just challenges with keeping it clean, keeping the things from clogging because it emits plastic in this case. We think that there's a community and that libraries or organizations that serve people with disabilities might be a really good place to actually get these. Imagine having a tactile object of everything in your chemistry curriculum for every student, completely within reach. Something like this costs now under $1 to produce. Math. I'm going to leave much of the detailed math to my friend Neil, but just to reiterate what Alex said, there is a typical problem that in most ebooks you might see an equation like a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and you just hear image. Not very useful. And there's a chicken and an egg problem, and that is that content producers are saying we'll produce more math markup language content, math ML, when there's more tools to read it. And the reading tools people say, well, when there's much more content, we'll produce our reading tools. Very frustrating. So we came up with something called MathML Cloud, which I will demonstrate during the demo session, that essentially allows you to take something input. So where we are having publishers produce math markup language content, it was getting lost because they needed it to work on all these screens that we have, and an image is just easier. Not good. So with MathML Cloud, we give you visual output. You actually can hear a description because it will add a text description automatically. And most importantly, the math markup language will stay available in the cloud so that as more reading tools can use it, they can get access to it. We see this as a bridge near term so that in the future, not a problem that the tools and the content will be in sync. But for right now, we are now having publishers do bulk uploads. This just got released in beta 2 weeks ago. Sonification as well, Neil will show, that's another way you can get access to diagrams, and I'm going to leave that to Neil for his demo so you can actually hear what a graph sounds like. And finally, all of these still images have their challenges, but the next wave of challenge is that more of these items that are being produced are actually interactive. So tomorrow and frankly today's educational materials move. That adds a lot of difficulty. So we're looking at how do you do educational simulations and have interactive widgets, number lines, quizzes, and not only 3D models like this, but 3D models that might have paint on them, conductive paint that will allow you to interact with a 3D model. Now the 3D model comes to life. Excuse me. This is an example of one interactive content widget that's been made available for a bar chart, where it actually tells you in a speech log what's changing when you change it. And the controls can all be used by a keyboard. So what's left? A lot. I'm sorry to say, there's still more to do. In Diagram, we're expanding the image description training module, looking at math end-to-end. So MathML Cloud is one part, but we think there's a big benefit of looking at math from a input to output perspective. Building an accessible content registry and repository, and that, I believe Alex referred to, so that more and more of these diagrams and accessible educational objects particularly are available around the world to everyone. We do, again, think that the interactivity is a critical thing for the future, so there's more work happening on that. And George briefly mentioned metadata. So we're going to be in a world for a while where some content is accessible and some isn't. And some is accessible to a baseline that George mentioned, and some is better. So how do you find it? So we've worked on a project that is now part of schema.org, which is the web search standard that helps you find things by their accessibility. So if you need something that's a video that's closed caption, you could actually search on that. And if you need something that has described images, you can search on that. So I think that's going to be another very important point, especially for librarians and others in the near term. I'm giving you many, many links to all of the areas I've mentioned today that I think you have in your resources. So Born Accessible, Diagram, MathML Cloud, and Poet. Thank you. So thank you. I'll do a brief demonstration of a couple of the tools that I talked about in the talk. The first is the Poet Image Description tool. So this is actually how you can go in and describe images inside a book. So for keeping this fast, I've already pulled up a book. As you can see, this has a number of graphs in it. So this is the first element, which is just doing a description. So this is not, we're not getting into sonification or anything in this tool. But you can see there are a number of images on the left-hand side, and these images are different sorts of line diagrams representing specific areas of a book. In this tool, you can scan up and down to go to different images. You can go through, and with each image, I'm going to move this over so you can hear me, and I can do this at the same time. So the first thing you do with it is to say, does this image need description? Well, I would say yes, it does, because a line diagram like this, you need something to tell you what's happening. So within the tool, you can actually start out and say, does it need description? Yes, no, or I don't know. Oftentimes we will do these sorts of things with volunteers, or in a publisher, it might be some levels of staff that first say, yes, describe it, and then they let someone else describe it. So it literally has workflow opportunities built in. So if I say yes, then it asks me, okay, what type of image is it? And within that, there's a list of different kinds of images. I mentioned artwork. We don't really have many tips for, but when you actually get down and start talking about things like line graphs, it will give you, a place to actually create the description and even a sample. So you can view a sample of this, and it'll tell you, here are guidelines. These are research-based guidelines that tell you, here's the best practice for describing a line graph. In this case, it tells you how to summarize the data in a table, as was mentioned earlier. Sometimes that's the quickest way, is just to be able to hear the data in a table rather than try to be told what the line looks like. You really want to understand the data behind it. And so this gives you guidelines and even a template. So you can literally copy and paste the text and put the correct information in. So this tells you something like figure whatever the number is a line graph with a certain title. The y-axis is labeled this in units. So it guides you through how you can describe this line graph in a way that's going to be effective. And as I said, certain things like line graphs, bar charts have good templates for them. It's a little more difficult when it's something that's a picture in a child's storybook, or even a map. We have some guidelines for maps, but it's still somewhat more limited. When you get into math and core science, quite useful. So when you actually go do the image description, then you save it, and then the book, once all the descriptions are done, can be uploaded back to wherever it came from. We do this with Bookshare today. We have volunteers who take books, add descriptions. We can go through and edit them, and you can see, as you look at different descriptions, which changes have been made as well. So if there's, for example, an author of the descriptions and 2 editing passes, you can actually see how they've changed over time. The kinds of files that this takes today are DAISY3 and EPUB3. One of the things we've talked a lot about with publishers is the fact that they are often not working in that format in the beginning of their flow. So they may start in something like Microsoft Word. This tool today does not cover that piece. So that's a quick view of Poet, but I also mentioned that there's Poet as a tool to do a description, and then there's Poet as a tool to help you understand how to describe, so that maybe a publisher isn't going to use this tool because they're going to do them in Word, but they want to understand what sorts of descriptions you need. So this is interactive, and you can walk through, and first it says, when do you make a description? Now, there's a whole decision tree. It's a little difficult to see on the screen, but you can walk through and say, you know, what kind of image is it? Is it repeated in the text? Is it important to describe? It could be purely ornamental, as George talked about earlier, where if I were to scroll through that other book, you'll just see blocks of color, because sometimes books, textbooks especially, just have lots of layout items. You don't need to describe that. It'd be a waste of time to describe and a waste of time for the reader to just hear blue box, blue box, blue box, blue box. So this gives you some hints of when to describe, and this is based off of actually guidelines from the Braille Authority of North America around when you need a tactile graphic. We sort of worked with them to help adapt it. So it first says when to do a description, and then says beyond that, when do you need some sort of tactile. And again, this is all up on the site itself. So then you actually pick an image and start to do a description. Earlier in my presentation, I showed a diagram of the heart and lungs. Here it is again. And it literally walks you through the kind of thought process you need. So which of the following best describes this type of image? Is it a photo? Is it a drawing? There's a whole long list. In this case, I would say it's the illustration of a process, because this is actually talking about how the heart pumps blood and the lungs work. And then it asks you things like, what is the purpose of this image? So it provides visual interest only, not very important to understanding, or it's very functional, like it's a button, or it provides information needed for understanding the subject. And in this case, this is a really important diagram for this chapter of this book to understand the heart and lungs. So I would say it provides information that's important. Does it provide information essential to understanding that's not available in the surrounding text? Now, in this case, we would look at the surrounding text, and in Poet, you can do that. You can actually scroll up and down the surrounding text. I happen to know in this case the answer is yes. Does it contain embedded text? As Neil mentioned, we often think about people who are blind or visually impaired, but there are also issues for people who have trouble reading the text, like people with dyslexia. So I would say, yes, this has a lot of embedded text. Would a text description adequately convey the main idea? This is where it gets a little tricky. Well, it could help. I think a tactile really would help here, which is why we use this as an example with a tactile. So I'm going to say no. Would a tactile representation convey the main idea better? Yes. And then here's why. It asks you questions about why. So I'm going to stop this demo here, but this gives you an idea of how you can walk through one image, and it gives you a really good idea of what you should say, how you should say it, and why. And all these questions lead up to giving you some answers as to then, for this type of image in this situation, how do you deal with that? Lastly, through Poet, there's a special little tool we're working on that gives you an image coverage checker. So one of the things we talked about from the beginning is to say, if there are images in a book, are they described? How many actually have alt text, which, as Volker mentioned, tends to be shorter text? How many have, in this case, it talks about prod notes, which is where Daisy has said to put the actual longer description, and now within EPUB 3, there's a lovely field called long description that helps with that. So we're working on the EPUB 3 version of this as well. And then, you know, are there actually captions for things that should be captioned? So this is the beginning, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but I pulled up this book last night, and it went through and said, here's where I'm looking at these specific places in the book to find where these descriptions might be. And it starts to give you, along with some of what George talked about, the EPUB check, this starts to give you an idea of how well is this book made accessible in this really tough area of images and graphics. So the last thing that I want to show you is the MathML Cloud tool. And as I mentioned, there are a few different ways to use this tool. So the first is you can enter an equation, and you can say, this is just on the web. Again, this is free and open, and you can go try it out. You can enter an equation in ASCII Math, in MathML, or in LaTeX. This happens to be a LaTeX message, and I'm going to tell it to process it. And assuming my connection is still going, it will come back and then display the result in multiple output formats. Now, this is where I can go turn on ChromeVox and have it speak it. This is a fairly complicated equation, but nothing to the extent that my other two friends have shown you, really. But it gives you a few things. It gives you a text description, and as we said, this is not the best thing. It's better to have the MathML that you can go through, but in the interim, well, that is not available in most readers, except Neil's pretty much, and iBooks. How do you possibly use your math? This is one way. So it'll display the text. It'll actually display the images, and it will display the math markup language. So the important thing, again, is that the MathML is there for stored in the cloud for access later. Now, this is the way you use it equation by equation. So you could go in and just say, I'm a teacher, my student needs 5 equations, and we're going to go in and let the student themselves even spit out some MathML equations. The way that we see more people using it is a bulk upload, so that a publisher could actually go back, and if you recall back in this other page, convert multiple equations, you can go in and upload an HTML5 file full of equations. And so we are working with some publishers right now, including Wiley and a couple others, who are trying it out to do bulk uploads. So all the equations they'd have in a book, that again, they're making the MathML, they're doing the right thing, they're doing exactly what we want, but then in the distribution chain, the MathML's going away. So this is a way to say, till they can get their distribution chain fixed and have MathML there, and the distribution chain includes the reading tool, this will actually allow them to do just a bulk upload of MathML equations and then convert it into all of these formats and then do a download again. So that's a little bit more about the detail of MathML Cloud. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friends to show you more cool, fun stuff on their end. Thank you.
Merci.